When facing e4, if black is willing to accept a space disadvantage in order to counterattack white's center, then black can play e6, turning the game into the French defense. White is allowed to seize more central space with d4, when black is prepared to counterattack white's center with d5, confronting white's undefended e4 pawn. It does allow white a space advantage, and black will need to address the restricted light-squared bishop, a consequence of playing e6 on the first move. White has several ways to respond to the pressure in the center. Exchanging pawns with e takes d5 liberates black's light-squared bishop after e takes d5, creating a symmetrical pawn structure. The exchange variation is a safe, if not particularly ambitious approach. White's most active way to maintain the tension is with knight c3, developing the piece and supporting the center, a subject of another video. In this video we'll examine knight d2, known as the Tarrasch variation, and will seek to understand why some players prefer to develop the knight to this less active-looking square. Before discussing the Tarrasch, we'll first explore what happens if white decides to resolve the tension with e5, taking more space in the center, known as the Advance variation. White's pawn invades black's territory, depriving the knight on g8 of its most active square, f6. Black's dark-squared bishop is also unable to enjoy the d6 square for the time being. If black decides to play passively, white may actively develop and enjoy a comfortable, risk-free advantage. The French defense is a counterattacking opening. White is allowed to create an advanced center with the idea of counterattacking it, starting with the essential pawn break, c5, immediately confronting white's center and threatening to dismantle the central pawn chain with c takes d4, when the e5 pawn is vulnerable to attack. White can support this key central pawn while extending the pawn chain with c3. White enjoys a pawn chain from b2 to e5 when the battle lines are clearly drawn. White will defend this impressive-looking center, preparing to actively develop behind it, and black will energetically try to tear it down. Sometimes black prematurely plays c takes d4, thinking that after c takes d4, black has reduced white's pawn chain from 4 to just 2 pawns. Although this is technically true, it's quite difficult to break down white's central grip. More importantly, by exchanging white's pawn on c3, white's queenside knight is ready to enter the game with knight c3, a square it did not enjoy prior to this premature pawn capture. It's better for black to avoid playing c takes d4 unless there is a concrete reason to do so. A common choice is to activate the knight with knight c6, continuing to add pressure against the hotly contested d4 square. At amateur level, pinning the knight with bishop b5 is seen far more often than it should, as black can calmly respond with bishop d7, unpinning the knight when black does not face any serious problems. It's easy for white to fall into a trap with the natural knight f3, supporting the center when black has the clever resource knight takes e5, winning a pawn as black's endangered knight discovers an attack against the unprotected bishop on b5. So if white captures the knight, let's say with knight takes e5, this is well met by bishop takes b5, slicing through the light squares, preventing white's king from castling. If white decides to respond with bishop takes d7 check, this allows black to play knight takes d7, when black is simply up a pawn. Prematurely developing the light-squared bishop is not advisable, so a more sensible choice is to play knight f3, supporting white's center. Bishop d7 is a solid, popular choice for black that's definitely worth exploring, and it may surprise you that another popular option is queen b6. Moving your queen out too early is generally not recommended, but in this closed structure, the queen can be quite effective on b6, adding pressure against d4, as well as the b2 pawn. When you play this position as white, don't forget that bishop e3, defending the d4 pawn, simply hangs the b2 pawn, leading to trouble for white. White's dark-squared pawn chain points toward the king side, so white's light-squared bishop would love to find action on the b1 to h7 diagonal with bishop d3. This is a tricky move, as it appears white's queen is no longer protecting the d4 pawn. This may tempt black to play c takes d4, which is a good move with proper understanding, but after c takes d4, black should not assume white has blundered a pawn, because after knight takes d4, black is actually losing a piece after knight takes d4. White's knight on d4 is untouchable, because if black plays queen takes d4, white wins the queen after bishop b5 check, checking the king while discovering the queen's attack against its counterpart on d4. This is one of the most important traps you need to know as you learn the French defense. Since knight takes d4 simply loses a piece, it appears white enjoys a comfortable game with an active light-squared bishop. Like many other French defense positions, it's not as simple as it seems, as black can play bishop d7, developing the light-squared bishop while clearing the path for a possible rook c8, taking advantage of the open c-file. More importantly, the bishop on d7 shields the king from any checks, so black is threatening to win a pawn with knight takes d4. White may decide to gambit the pawn by castling, known as the speculative Milner-Berry gambit. If white decides to play bishop c2, trying to maintain the bishop on its desirable diagonal, this is well met by knight b4. Black is prepared to claim the bishop pair, and with it a favorable game. If white tries to avoid this exchange with bishop b3, or offering an exchange of bishops with bishop a4, this turns a slightly unpleasant position into a positional nightmare after the resourceful queen a6. Attacking the bishop, preventing white's king from castling, as well as preparing the unpleasant check knight d3. It looks like black may be in some trouble after bishop takes d7 check. King takes d7. It's not every day that you'll see a king advance up the board on move 10, with queens and rooks still on the board, but we can come to appreciate that black enjoys an overwhelming advantage. Since the center is closed, it's not easy to expose black's king. On the other hand, with knight d3 check in the air, white's king is in serious trouble. Since the desirable bishop d3 is not sustainable without committing to a speculative gambit, the light-squared bishop may decide to enter the game from the more modest e2 square. We mentioned earlier that black should not play c takes d4 prematurely, but in this case black has a concrete plan starting with c takes d4. C takes d4. Now that the d4 pawn is no longer protected by another pawn on c3, this becomes an important target for black. The advanced variation challenges black to find a way to harmoniously develop the king side. This is exactly what black has in mind with either knight g to e7, intending to move the knight to f5, adding pressure against d4, or the more combative route, knight h6. Moving the knight to h6 invites white to play the double-edged bishop takes h6, when black can play the intermediate capture queen takes b2, prior to capturing the bishop on h6. This line is actually not bad for white, and the interested viewer is encouraged to explore the complications after knight b to d2. In the style of knight h6, one interesting idea for white is to play knight a3, intending to meet knight f5, attacking d4, with knight c2, reinforcing this important central square. Since black has exchanged pawns on the d4 square, opening up c3 as a result, white may also consider the direct knight c3, preparing to meet knight f5, ganging up on the d4 pawn with knight a4, attacking black's queen, inviting queen a5 check. If both sides are in a peaceful mood, knight c3 and queen b6 could repeat the position, but black could also continue the struggle with bishop b4, intensifying the pressure against the pinned knight. Grandmaster Sergei Movsisyan has played the resourceful king f1, with the idea of later advancing the g-pawn, preparing king g2. One idea for black is to respond with b5, attacking the knight, followed by gaining more space with b4, clearing the path for a future bishop a6, placing serious pressure down the f1 to a6 diagonal. Against queen a5, a more natural-looking response is bishop d2, allowing black's other minor piece on the king side to enter the action with bishop b4. White's d4 pawn remains quite vulnerable, so white can support it with bishop c3, revealing the queen's protection of the d4 pawn. White's center is holding together for the time being, although black enjoys a comfortable, active game. Instead of developing the light-squared bishop, white may remain flexible with this decision by first playing a3. This may look like a passive choice, but it's a serious way to challenge black's control over the queen side. White is prepared to strike back on the queen side with b4, confronting the c5 pawn. So black has to decide whether or not to allow this plan. If black tries to prevent b4 with a5, increasing black's control over the b4 square. Now that a3 has been played, white can comfortably play bishop d3. This looks very similar to the line we previously examined, but in this case after c takes d4. C takes d4. Black is unable to win a pawn with knight takes d4 as long as knight takes d4 followed by bishop b5 check is still in the air. So after bishop d7, shielding the king and preparing knight takes d4, white can play bishop c2. revealing the queen's protection of d4. White's bishop enjoys the wonderful b1 to h7 diagonal, as knight b4 is no longer a resource thanks to the a3 pawn. The French defense is filled with interesting positional subtleties that can elevate your overall positional understanding. Another way to discourage b4 is to play the more positionally minded c4, releasing the tension against the important d4 square, helping White stabilize the center. But this move also clamps down on the weakened b3 square, a consequence of playing a3. If White tries to play b4, this is well met by en passant with c takes b3. Black will often play the moves bishop d7 and knight a5, discouraging White's b-pawn from advancing. The c4 pawn also restricts White's light-squared bishop. It's not uncommon for Black to play bishop d7 and queenside castling, and White may respond with g3, h4, preparing to activate the light-squared bishop with bishop h3, when White will likely castle kingside. This leads to a more positional struggle in which an extended maneuvering phase may be needed before a direct clash of forces may occur. Instead of the prophylactic c4, Black may simply ignore White's plans and play knight h6, eyeing the f5 square in order to join the central struggle. White is ready to challenge Black on the queenside with b4, forcing Black to make a decision with the threatened c5 pawn. So Black typically continues with c takes d4. White may decide to respond automatically with c takes d4, preparing to meet knight f5 with bishop b2, supporting the d4 pawn. Another interesting choice is to play the intermediate capture bishop takes h6, compromising Black's structure after g takes h6, and only then capturing the d4 pawn. Grandmaster Nikita Vityagov, a strong exponent of the French defense, activated the light-squared bishop with bishop d7. His opponent, a pioneer of the a3 system in the advanced variation, Grandmaster Evgeny Sveshnikov, highlights another use behind the a3 move, allowing White to play rook a2. This flexible rook is ready to enter the game, either by fighting for control of the open c-file, or possibly preparing to defend the d4 pawn with rook d2 if necessary. Although Black's doubled, isolated h-pawns do not look so impressive, it does allow Black to activate the kingside rook with rook g8. This move delays White's ability to develop the light-squared bishop by attacking the g2 pawn, while also preparing to invade White's position with rook g4, adding pressure against the d4 pawn and creating the possibility of rook e4 check. It's possible to play g3, preparing to develop the light-squared bishop, when White is prepared to respond to rook g4 with rook d2, supporting the center. But several grandmasters, including Sveshnikov himself in this game, also may decide to prevent this option with h3. Black continued with rook c8. Once again, we see Black's king is in no rush to exit the center based upon the closed nature of the position, a common theme in several French defense lines. White countered Black's activity on the c-file with rook c2. When after bishop e7, developing the dark-squared bishop, White addressed the issue of the light-squared bishop, starting with g3. Now that the bishop is no longer babysitting the g2 pawn, it may enter the game with bishop g2, or possibly e2. Black decided to take a moment to discourage any possible b5 ideas with a6, when White decided to activate the bishop on e2. We now see another thematic pawn break in the French defense, f6, inviting White to capture the pawn, activating the dark-squared bishop on the long diagonal. White did not feel so generous and instead decided to play queen d3, centralizing the queen while attacking the unprotected h7 pawn. So Black reinforced the position with rook g7, setting the stage for a complex middle game struggle. White enjoys more space, but the center remains under serious pressure. There was certainly nothing wrong with castling immediately, but White decided to play knight b to d2 when Black responded with f takes e5, opening up the f-file when Black prepared the instructive king maneuver king f8 to g8, allowing Black's queenside rook to communicate with the kingside if necessary. Grandmaster Vityagov went on to win this game, although White's opening play was certainly not at fault. The advanced variation with e5 is a direct clash between White's central space advantage and Black's ability to successfully counterattack it, when both sides have good arguments for their respective causes. Advancing the pawn forward is less popular than increasing the tension in the center by activating the queenside knight. Knight c3 is White's most active choice, but this does allow the winner with bishop b4, pinning the knight, and preparing a structural imbalance with bishop takes c3 check. leading to highly complex play. If white would prefer to enjoy more control in the position and avoid this possibility, then a popular alternative is knight d2. This is less ambitious than knight c3, but it does prepare a solid foundation upon which to challenge black's defenses. The winner with bishop b4 is no longer an option, as white can simply play c3. The knight on d2 does obstruct the dark-squared bishop, but as we'll see, white may have an instructive maneuver in mind to address this issue. D takes e4 is known as the Rubinstein variation, leading to solid but somewhat passive play. Slightly exotic-looking variations such as bishop e7 and knight c6 are not without merit, but black's main decision is whether to attack white's center with c5 or knight f6. If black decides to play knight f6, confronting white's e4 pawn, we can see some similarities to the advance variation with e5, gaining a tempo against the knight. The knight is no longer on a clear path to challenge white's d4 pawn from the f5 square, so it usually retreats to the d7 square. The knight appears a bit awkwardly placed on this square, although it does add immediate pressure to white's e5 pawn, supporting black's typical pawn break c5 and f6. Unlike the advanced variation, white has less trouble favorably activating the light-squared bishop with bishop d3, preparing to meet the typical counterstrike c5 with c3. The struggle over d4 intensifies with knight c6, when white may decide to play knight g to f3, a solid choice worth considering, but another instructive idea is knight e2. White reserves the f3 square for the other knight, preparing to meet queen b6 with knight f3, leading to interesting play in which white maintains fairly good control in the center. A more combative choice for black is to play c takes d4, reducing white's pawn chain after c takes d4, preparing to assault white's center with the other thematic pawn break, f6. Attacking e6 with knight f4 allows black to play knight takes d4. When queen h5 check leads to complex play, black is prepared to sacrifice the exchange in order to destroy white's center. This chaotic-looking approach does not promise white an advantage, so a more common choice is to resolve the tension with e takes f6. White opens the e-file, leading to black's backward e6 pawn. Black typically responds with knight takes f6, returning the knight to a more active square while revealing the light-squared bishop's protection of the e6 pawn, which is a useful, if not somewhat passive role for the bishop. White may decide to play knight f3, or immediately castle. Black's dark-squared bishop enters the action with bishop d6, when white is prepared to play knight f3, improving the position of the knight while reinforcing the d4 square. This also clears the path for the dark-squared bishop, so if black decides to castle, white can play bishop f4, preparing to exchange black's more active bishop, greatly restricting black's potential for counterplay. If black wants to avoid simplifying the position, then a strong choice is queen c7, discouraging bishop f4 while creating a dangerous queen-bishop battery pointing toward white's castled kingside. Knight c3, threatening knight b5 is worth examining, when black should spend a tempo preventing this idea with a6. Grandmaster David Navarez played the subtle h3, anticipating some of the possible pressure against white's kingside. He won a beautiful game in this line that is worth exploring, although this is certainly not a refutation of black's setup. A more direct path is to play bishop g5, adding pressure against black's knight, so black typically supports the knight by castling kingside. Black's rook enjoys the semi-open f-file, an important source for counterplay. Rook c1, pinning the knight on the open file is one sensible path, and if white wants to confront black's dark-squared bishop, another interesting idea is bishop h4, intending to play bishop g3, exchanging black's powerful dark-squared bishop. Once again, black is not interested in allowing this plan, so an important idea is knight h5, preparing to meet bishop g3 with knight takes g3, preserving black's dark-squared bishop. The knight also eyes the f4 square, while opening up the rook on f8, creating the possibility of a future exchange sacrifice with rook takes f3. Moving the knight to h5 weakens black's kingside defenses, so white can also build a powerful queen-bishop battery with queen c2, aiming at the h7 pawn. g6 allows a crushing sacrifice on the kingside with bishop takes g6, when black's defenses will fall apart. So black should move the h-pawn to safety with h6, weakening the kingside light squares. White is able to exploit this fact with bishop h7 check, forcing black's king to the corner. and only then play bishop g6. Knight f6 provokes a more closed game by inviting e5. If black would prefer a more open game, then another popular choice is to play c5, placing both of white's central pawns under pressure. Knight g to f3 is a flexible response to explore, or white may decide to clarify the central tension with e takes d5. If black decides to play the natural e takes d5, this often leads to black accepting an isolated queen's pawn, which is not to everyone's taste. White generally has comfortable play, starting with knight g to f3, or else by playing the disruptive bishop b5 check. White can more or less force black to accept an isolated queen's pawn by playing queen e2 check on the next move. For example, if black plays bishop d7, white can play queen e2 check, provoking bishop e7, when white can play d takes c5, saddling black with an isolated queen's pawn. White is prepared to play knight b3, making black spend more effort in regaining the c5 pawn. This approach has been employed by world champion Anatoly Karpov on multiple occasions. That being said, black does not need to panic. As long as black doesn't mind playing with the IQP, this is also a playable line worth exploring in greater depth. If black would prefer to avoid the isolated queen pawn, the more modern approach is to capture with the queen, placing immediate pressure against white's center. Although d takes c5 is certainly possible, white can temporarily sacrifice the pawn with knight g to f3. A popular continuation is c takes d4, allowing white to gain a tempo against the queen with bishop c4. There's no shortage of queen moves available, but black's most common and reliable choice has been queen d6. Notice that harassing the queen with knight e4 allows queen b4 check, so it's a good idea for white to castle. Now that knight e4 is a desirable option, it makes sense for black to prevent this idea while developing with knight f6. White surrounds black's extra pawn with knight b3. White enjoys a serious lead in development, so black should return the pawn to mobilize the forces with knight c6, allowing white to regain the pawn with knight b takes d4, when black exchanges a pair of knights with knight takes d4. It's possible for white to offer an exchange of queens with queen takes d4, when black should not fear these simplifications. A far more popular choice is to play knight takes d4. One modern choice for black is to play a6, securing the b5 square, preparing to play queen c7, gaining a tempo against the bishop. There is also nothing wrong with bishop e7, focusing on simple development. This is a good moment to anchor the knight with c3, liberating the queen from the defensive duties of the knight, preparing to meet kingside castling with queen f3, adding pressure against black's queenside while also preparing bishop f4. So black's queen may continue its journey with queen c7, gaining a tempo against the bishop, when white typically plays bishop b3. White's bishop may later dream of building a dangerous battery with bishop c2, followed by queen d3, pointing at black's castled kingside. Black has several interesting ideas to explore, including grabbing space on the queen side with a5, developing the light-squared bishop with bishop d7, dreaming of occupying the c6 square, creating pressure down the long light-squared diagonal. Another idea is to anticipate white's idea of bishop f4 and play bishop d6, improving the position of the bishop and threatening to capture a pawn on h2. White may relieve this pressure by playing h3. The annoying fork knight b5 is in the air, so this is a good moment for black's light-squared bishop to enter the action while preventing this idea with bishop d7, when white's dark-squared bishop can enter the action with bishop g5, adding pressure against black's vulnerable f6 knight. Defending the knight while remaining active with bishop e5 is a good idea, and black may first decide to push white's king into the corner with bishop h2 check, forcing king h1, followed by defending black's vulnerable knight with bishop e5. White may centralize both of the rooks, and black may consider the maneuver rook f to d8, preparing to open up the d-file and add pressure against white's knight with bishop e8, setting the stage for a complex positional struggle. The French advance with e5, or supporting the center with knight d2, known as the Tarrasch variation, are both instructive ways to challenge the French. White typically enjoys a space advantage, and with it, the chances for more active piece play. This space advantage is far from a one-way street, as black will energetically counterattack white's center, when a complex positional struggle will typically reward the more experienced and better prepared player. Thanks for exploring these instructive lines in the French defense, and now you have no shortage of interesting ideas to explore the next time the French defense makes an appearance in your game, right here on chess.com.